wanted to start by welcoming you all today. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Let me see if I can take one of these. Does that work? Yes. Much better. So welcome again, and let me take a few minutes to explain the context in which this event is taking place. As just mentioned, this is the first DC-based event of the Global Evaluation Week, the first Global Evaluation Week, an event, or rather a series of events that IEG and the CLEAR centers, and I'll tell you a bit about them soon, are organizing around the world. It's a global evaluation week, but that does not take place in a central center as many global evaluation weeks did in the past. It takes place in a decentralized manner with events being organized at local level all around the world. In reality, we have about 270 events being organized this week in 70 cities, in 39 countries, in 5 continents. The idea behind the Global Evaluation Week started from the recognition that, on the one hand, the evaluation profession and the global knowledge around the evaluation profession is evolving very rapidly, and that there is, of course, a huge benefit in all of those practicing monitoring and evaluation to know what's going on at global level. But at the same time, there is a lot of interest in what is happening at local level, and a lot of very good work is happening there, and a need for global sharing the knowledge between those working at local levels, but also from them to regional or global levels is also found extremely important. So the overall objective of the Global Evaluation Week is to foster knowledge sharing, networking on M&E at all levels in the world. Starting from the ground up and back. The Global Evaluation Week is organized or is co-sponsored by us and the CLEAR centers. For those who do not know the CLEAR centers, they are a network of 6 M&E centers that are were supported by multilateral and bilateral donors, as well as think tank and research institutes. They focus each on a specific region in the world, and their objective is really to foster greater use of evaluation around the world, but especially in the global south, to foster evidence-based decision-making, use of evidence for learning, course correction, and of course greater accountability around the world. So this is one of the initiatives that they are supporting as a network to foster greater awareness around evaluation and monitoring around the world, knowledge sharing about what works, and ultimately, hopefully, greater use of evaluation. So we're extremely pleased to be hosting our own event as part of this series. Joss will introduce the panel. We're extremely pleased to have all of you here, and very proud of your participation. But Joss will introduce the panel and the event. I just want to really welcome you again in the World Bank for this first local event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Esteemed colleagues, we are looking forward to an interesting conversation this afternoon about 2 different topics. As you may have noted from the program, there is a second session after this one, which will be from 2 to 5, in which we will explore the topic of using geospatial data in evaluation, especially from the perspective of the question of using geospatial data for looking at the targeting or geospatial outreach question. So I hope you will be interested in staying and joining us for that conversation as well. For the moment, I'm very pleased to introduce you to the first part of the session. And let me give you a little bit of an introduction so we have the right frame of mind. So as you know, esteemed colleagues, the world of international development is rapidly changing, and evaluation is also changing with it. And we think there's a lot to say about developments in theory, development in methods, some of which are new, developments in technologies, as well as developments in new data, which will shape evaluative practice in coming decades. And in the second part of the session this afternoon, we will talk about one specific aspect of this innovation, which is the use of geospatial data. We are not going to cover this entire field of what are advances in evaluative evidence. Instead, we are going to explore 2 interesting, which I think complementary lines of thought. So the first line of thought is the idea that the results agenda, which has been influencing international development for several decades, which includes a growing body of impact evaluation work, has been really changing in recent years. And using rigorous impact evaluations as a basis, there has been a lot of work around developing repositories of knowledge, which provide opportunities for evaluators to synthesize knowledge and link this knowledge more effectively to policy-making processes. And there are even new technologies available, machine learning, which can perhaps even help us to do this a little bit more efficiently in the future. So that's one line of thought. A second line of thought is the idea that we always have to, as evaluators, realize that the world is really complex. And causal processes around an intervention, they tend to be interlinked with other causal factors, including other interventions. So to understand processes of change and how they influence poverty levels or how they influence ecosystems, they are often highly context-specific and often very uncertain. So good evaluative work, independent of how we move forward on new data, new technologies, always will require good theory and good detective work. So these complementary lines of thought will be elucidated respectively by Howard White and Michael Woolcock, who are two well-known experts in the international development and evaluation community, and I will introduce them in a moment. After their respective presentations, the presentation by Howard and Michael, I will give the floor to my esteemed colleague Alison Evans, who will lead us into a conversation with Howard and Michael with the fundamental question, okay, what can independent evaluation and evaluation more broadly now learn from these two lines of thought that were presented? Or more generally speaking, how can evaluation become more innovative, more credible, more evidence-based, and more theory-informed to enhance its contribution to development effectiveness? So this by means of introduction. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the first speaker of this seminar, Howard White, who is the CEO of the Campbell Collaboration. He was previously director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and he also previously worked at IG. He has a long record, which I'm sure you are able to read, and we are very pleased to have him here. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Howard.
Is this me? Yeah, okay. That's okay. Thank you. So, welcome everybody. So this presentation is actually a sequel to a presentation I gave to IG some months ago called the Evidence Revolution. So, as I go along, I'll try and catch you up, those of you that weren't at the first episode in the series, as what that was about, and then come to the bits that come into this sequel. So the last presentation that you mostly missed was on the 4 waves of the evidence revolution. And the first wave of this revolution was the results agenda being launched in the 1990s excuse me, as part of new public management. And the key part of that, for our concern here, was an introduction to focus on outcomes rather than inputs. So prior to this, back in the 80s and so on, when I started working, we measured performance by inputs or activities or best outputs. The results revolution back in the 1990s said no, you have to look at final outcomes like poverty, child death, girls going to school, women being empowered and so on. So that was a good thing. And one of the first places it took place, actually here in the bank in 1992, the Wappenhans report required all bank projects to start having key performance indicators at outcome level. In the US government, the Government Results Performance Act of 1993 required all US government agencies to institute more basically results frameworks. Here in the bank it took off somewhat slowly, but in the US government it actually took off and was enforced by the General Accounting Office to have these results frameworks. So agencies like USAID were monitoring indicators like GDP per capita growth and infant mortality at the country level, as measures of their agency's performance. By the 2000s, by 2000, 2001, GAO was writing to USID saying, look, these annual results reports you're doing, reporting in mortality and GDP and so on, actually don't tell us anything about USID's performance, because these outcomes are affected by so many different factors. So back in 2002, USID abandoned results reporting as a way of measuring agency performance. And that's the important point to note, that results frameworks with outcome level indicators cannot tell us about agency performance. So we knew that then, we know it now. The problem is that many agencies adopt results frameworks, the bank has them at project level and across the corporate level, adopt them, and even if they might have small print saying, they have a small print, here's tier 1 of the World Bank results framework, even if they have small print saying, oh, but tier 1 outcomes don't tell us what the bank's achieved, people don't read the small print. Okay, so managers get lulled into thinking these indicators somehow actually capture what agencies is doing. And there's a problem here, there's a trade-off between many things I'm going to talk about, in the trade-off between accountability and lesson learning. So the evidence revolution has been about using evidence, research evidence, evaluations for lesson learning. And there's been a big push to use these things instead for accountability, which is not always the best use. So people want to use results frameworks for accountability, and actually using them for lesson learning has sort of fallen by the wayside. Now, when we started getting this focus on results in the development community in the early 2000s, 10 years ago, the former administrator of USID, Andrew Natsios, published a report by the Centre for Global Development criticising this growth of use of indicators. And in the start of that report, he published this possibly apocryphal letter from Wellington that the Duke of Wellington wrote, many of you have probably seen this, Duke of Wellington wrote back to the Foreign Office during his campaign to defeat Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula. And he wrote back saying that, regrettably, the sum of 1 shilling and 9p remains unaccounted for, and there's been a hideous and confused number of jams of raspberry jam issued to one cavalry unit. Then he says to the Foreign Office, now either I can actually train an army of uniformed British clerks for the benefit of the accountants in London, or I can actually beat the French. But I can't do both, which you want me to do. Okay, Natchez' point was, okay, look, all of this accounting, all this reporting we're doing, all this results reporting we're doing is getting in the way of actually going out and doing development. So we can't do both. So I think he's wrong. I'm not putting up here to agree with him. I think he's wrong. So my view is that if Wellington was counting the raspberry jam himself, he was a dreadful micromanager. Okay? As Napoleon knew, armies marched on their stomach. So the raspberry jam matters. So someone in Wellington's army should be counting the raspberry jam. But Wellington needed an MIS, Management Information System, with 2 pieces of information. Where are the French and how many are there? Okay? So we all need different information. So we do need Management Information System. We do need results frameworks, but we have to use them properly. And I think there's a case to try and save monitoring from the results agenda. Yes? So part of what I'm doing in the work I'm currently doing with YOS is looking at, well, what could IG do to help save results, monitoring the results agenda? And actually, most of the things I thought of, they're doing them. So I'll just say, keep on doing what you're doing, it's good. So I think there should be periodic in-depth IG studies of monitoring done by the bank. So there's a report called ROSES, which has been done just once so far, that looks at the self-evaluation work of the bank, and it includes the monitoring work. So it's been done once, do it again. I do think you should look at the use of results by the bank. There has been a report doing that, do some more. There should be a report on how the bank's supporting data collection, data initiatives. Just done a report on that, so do another one, and it's a while with a different focus. The ICR reviews that IEG does of all ICR reviews, as well as ICR does a review, do have a section discussing M&E, designing bank programs, bank operations. and I looked at a number of them, thinking they were got to discuss evaluation, not monitoring. In fact, jobs is anything they don't have to evaluate. And there's a fairly clear fund around. Not everything is quite good, but sometimes inappropriate or bad indicators can't be measured, or some outcomes that don't have indicators for them, or there's lack of user engagement in designing the inmate system. So these are very sort of clear messages coming out. There's no other evaluation agency that does what IEG does in terms of reviewing the M&E and self-evaluation work of its own organisation. And I think IEG will be more vocal about this, telling other agencies about it, so other agencies also do it. So my takeaway message from the first wave of the results agenda was actually the monitoring parts, and monitoring needs to be saved from results so we don't lose sight of the lesson learning aspect of monitoring rather than the accountability role of all these numbers that get generated in results frameworks. And so IEG's work in operational monitoring is important, deserves actually more attention, more action to be taken on the basis of what's being done. The second wave, so when it got realised that actually results don't tell you what difference your programs are making. To do that, you need impact evaluation. And that was the rise of randomised control trials in particular, but impact evaluation more generally. So 3IE has a database of impact evaluations, and from that you can see in the early 2000s there were 50 IEs being published a year, whereas by 2012 there were 500 IEs being published a year. There are now over 5,000 impact evaluation development programs in the 3I database. So there's been enormous growth in the rise of impact evaluations. Now, I'm not going to talk about the various issues there are in impact evaluations. I'm going to talk about what I think are implications for IEG, and in particular, I'm going to just look at one implication for IEG. There are others, they're in the paper, it's going to be out in some time, but just for now, this is a summary of different approach papers in the last three or 4 years from IEG about what's called the evaluation design. The approach paper has an evaluation design matrix where they take the different evaluation questions and say what evaluation design features they're going to use, approaches they're going to use to answer those questions. And basically, all IEG evaluations have a series of case studies, can be 5 or 6. They do a portfolio review. They have a structured literature review or desk review of project documents, strategy documents and so on, ICRs and so on, and then they do some semi-structured interviews with TTLs, people in the country, key stakeholders and so on. So here's what describes the evaluation design. None of these are methods of evaluation. These are methods of data collection. So what method are you going to use? I'm going to use data. Data are not a method, okay? It's like saying, I'm going to do an econometric analysis, what's your model going to be? I'm going to use data. It's not a model, okay? So these are not methods. There's 3 exceptions. One where they say they're going to use process tracing or QCA, one where they say use contribution analysis, and one where they say, actually, I'm not going to use a method because I'm not going to look at causal analysis. And so, and that's in the case studies. But all of the others, they don't actually say what method's going to be used to actually analyse the data to answer the evaluation questions. Now, different methods of analysis approach different questions, and IEG evaluations do normally try to answer causal questions. So they do have to tackle that tricky issue of small or middle-end causal analysis, but they also have straightforward factual analysis about portfolio trends and so on. But there's an analysis, there's a method for that analysis. And the approach papers are generally methods free. So the work that Yossi's team have been doing now for a few years is to improve the quality of methods in IEG evaluations, and that's essential work to actually have clarity of methods. I'm not saying finished products don't have methods. They do have methods. They don't plan on what those methods are going to be. They're not explicit about those methods ex ante, which would be good practice. So the second takeaway message, which comes out from impact evaluation, where we had a growth of use of method to answer causal questions using large N designs, is we need to pay explicit attention to methods. And there is work going on in IEG to develop more explicit attention to methods, and that work needs to keep going. The third wave has been systematic reviews. So we have growing bodies of evidence, and now how are we going to learn from those bodies of evidence? We're going to draw across them and actually summarise what the evidence says. And I gave a talk in IEG a couple of years ago where I said actually a lot of what I know about reviews I learned here when I was working in IEG, because what IEG does in its thematic and sector reviews is a very similar methodology, systematic reviews. It's similar but not identical. And one part of the paper I'm writing will identify where there are differences and where I think IEG approaches could learn from being more systematic. This is very important. You know there's a replication crisis. What you may be less aware of is also there's enormous literature on potential errors and biases. So we can't replicate existing studies, and that's partly, well, it is because actually existing studies have errors. So studies look at coding errors. This is where we extract data from studies, just basic information and what the studies say about what they found. And studies that look at the accuracy of coding find coding error rates around 30 to 50%. That's very high. This is why we require double coding in reviews to reduce the error rates to 10, 15% at most. And then there's publication bias. There's enormous outcome reporting bias, selective reporting results, and so on. And so systematic reviews are a way of trying to overcome these biases. And so the implications for IEG is that research is plagued by high rates of error and bias, and systematic review methodologies are intended to reduce those potential biases. And there's lots of things we do in reviews, like, say, double coding, and very precise definitions, identification of what actually it is we're evaluating, are things I think IEG needs to pay more attention to get more confident, what we call in the review community, having more confident study findings. So we want to identify potential sources of bias, it's very hard in qualitative analysis, and try and minimise those potential sources of bias. The fourth way of the evidence revolution is knowledge brokering. Once we have all the reviews, what are we going to do with them? So one model I particularly promote is the What Works approach, which is here in the US and the UK. What Works centres in education, social care, crime and justice, promote evidence from RCTs on what's effective. But this is particularly, sorry, jumping ahead. So the What Works centres are here at the top of this what I call the evidence pyramid. So we have data, and this is another point I was making earlier on. People often conflate data with evidence. Data are not evidence. Data is something we use to construct evidence through analysis. So we analyse data into studies, we summarize studies and reviews, all those go to databases or maps, and then we have these evidence portals, guidelines and checklists, which are evidence products that allow the user to use the evidence without going back and looking at the research reports. So the point about an evidence portal is they say, here's what the evidence says, this helps you decide what to do in a decision-making tool without having the user need to go back and consult the original research report. So the growth of these things has driven reduced evidence. In health, it's come mainly through guidelines. So WHO produces guidelines, different national agencies like NICE in the UK produce national guidelines, all based on high-quality systematic reviews. But the evidence portal for education in England by the Education Endowment Foundation has evidence on 34 different interventions to improve learning outcomes, all based on systematic reviews. So what you're doing here is pulling together evidence, presenting it in ways that's very usable. I've just got one example here. Here's what's called a BMJ rapid recommendation. So this is a particular, fairly specific medical intervention, and it tells you whether the evidence favours this treatment or this treatment, whether the evidence is strong or weak, and it breaks it down by age group. And it tells you why, actually, what the factor that means why the variation in recommendation comes by age. So this helps to inform a decision-making process. And if you trust the BMJ Rapid Rec, so based on Cochrane reviews, then you don't need to know more about what the evidence in the review. You don't need to reread the research report, because you've got this nice infographic. You can sit with the patient and say, well, you know, we've looked at the evidence, and actually, for your age group, it's strongly in favour of SAVRA, rather than the actually putting the thing inside the pattern. So you can use this as a doctor with your patient, a clear infographic summarising evidence. This is just one example. There are many, many examples of evidence-based platforms and portals and tools to help guide decision makers. So knowledge brokering is an activity in its own right. It's grown as a large activity. It's much more than traditional dissemination. It's much more than having a policy brief, much more than doing some workshops. And I think there's quite a lot IEG could do to exploit the global public good element of its reports by having much more out there in terms of what its evidence says in usable and accessible ways. We think there's probably a fifth wave coming of the enormous potentials offered by big data. Big data can do real-time evaluation, it can do real-time synthesis, and those possibilities are starting to be realised both on the operation side of the bank, and IEG should be tapping into those and finding its own ways. So in the systematic review community, we already have machine learning to drive searches and help screen results from searches. You can power those with AI as well to keep an automated living maps, living evidence maps, for example. You can automate big data extraction and the coding and data extraction and the meta-analysis, so you can have living reviews. That's already happening for quantitative data. Potentially, it's already the potential there to happen for soft qualitative data as well. I haven't seen it done for quantitative data in a good way, but it's going to happen very soon. Big data opportunities are different as more and more administrative data become available across the developing world now, and even in countries like India, you have a lot of big data available on individuals, lots of different data sources going down, they're increasingly getting linked. So lots of opportunity for real-time evaluations that even IEG can tap into. It doesn't have to just be on the operational side. And there's lots of scope for experimenting there. I would think, given your mandate in the end is to deliver the evaluations, you have to have some fail-safe to know that you can deliver the evaluation with one means or another. But I would encourage you to continue down that road. So the overall impression, overall message is I do think IEG does remain at the forefront of evaluation. I've always believed that. I've worked on development evaluation all my career, basically, and always, when I was outside, been a bit of awe of IEG. When I've been inside, had sort of healthy respect for my colleagues, and now from the outside looking back in, I see that more or less the work IEG is doing is at the forefront of evaluation. When the paper comes out, it will have some critical comments on some areas where I think work can be improved, but actually the main thing is the need to invest in methods, and so ensure you have clear and transparent evidence standards. This is what drives the evidence revolution. It's basically being transparent about what our evidence standards are, so we become trusted source of evidence. Why will people go to a Campbell review and trust what the Campbell review says? Because they trust in our methods, not because they know I've heard of Howard White or whatever. I trust in the methods of a Campbell review. And that's what IEG, I think, has, but you need to stay there by making sure you do stay up to front, up to pace, up to speed, up to speed with methods. There are a lot of methods debates going on right now around complexity. We're going to hear about that now, about complexity, causal methods in the context of complexity, about causal methods in small n context, and so on. And I think IEG needs to stay abreast of those and continue doing world-class evaluations in those areas. So thank you very much. Do check out our website. And do come to What Was Global Summit. I've got some postcards somewhere, I'll put them out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard. Please keep your questions until later. We are going to immediately continue with the second presentation. So let me invite to the podium Michael Woolcock, who is a lead social scientist at the bank's development research group. He's also been a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government for more than 10 years, and he has been a prolific author in the field of international development, publishing, among other things, on the topic of complexity in development evaluation. Mike.
A beautiful thing's going to happen for me here. Done. Just go down. And keep going. Done. Nope, that's you. Yeah, am I just following sequentially? Yeah,
No, that's it. No.
Do we need a completely different one for me? Okay. So. There we go. There we go. Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation and to be part of a learning process, because that's ultimately, I think, most of what we're trying to achieve with a lot of this work is to help ourselves as individuals, as teams, as organizations, as professions to come to a better understanding of how ultimately evaluation contributes to the learning and effectiveness of our work. I'm going to focus specifically on these questions of complexity. I think for quite a while I've sort of taken it as my mission in life to try and simplify what everybody thinks is complicated and to complicate what everybody thinks is simple. I have 20 minutes, which is the definition of trying to crunch complexity into something simple. But as part of that process, I hope I can also lay out some general ideas about how I've come to think about assessing complex interventions, largely on the basis of hard-won experience, but also through nearly a career's worth now of trying to work with other people who are also in a similar kind of situation. Just to extend, I guess, sort of, or build on part of what Howard said before, I think one of the revolutions, perhaps in development more generally, has just, since the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, just been this massive expansion in the ambition and the domains of activity in which we, the world, claim to be acting in. Right? So if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, 8 of them are still largely very focused on inputs, even in 2000. Now with 17 goals, 167 whatever different indicators and targets that we're supposed to be meeting, from providing health and education for all, justice and accountable institutions at all levels. There's just this formalized ambition with regards to what we're trying to do and what we claim to be doing. And with that then inherently goes the necessity of engaging with highly complex problems and trying to wield corresponding interventions to try and do something about those. And it then falls to evaluators to sort of try and get their heads around this, where once perhaps we were trying to evaluate roads or ports or tax credits, now we're trying to assess interventions like empowering women, about trying to consolidate peace agreements. We're trying to engage whether public sector reforms are working or not. And we've got this vastly bigger mandate and ambition. And for that, then I think we need to have a corresponding set of social scientific tools that can help us to get our heads around that. So I'm just going to open with this quick case study from and use it sort of as emblematic of sort of one of the issues that I've been pushing pretty hard over the last few years. Indeed, from the first issue of the Journal of Development Effectiveness that Howard is the editor of. I'm just going to use just an example of a very famous paper that came out a few years ago now, but was one of the harbingers of doing pre-analysis plans with a randomized controlled trial in a difficult country. It was sort of hailed as this wonderful, serious, rigorous piece of work, and it is that. I know these authors, they're good friends of mine, so this is not a sort of vindictive sort of critique I'm now going to launch. But the paper concludes, the project they're trying to assess is in a post-conflict country in Africa, and it's trying simultaneously, this particular project, is simultaneously trying to create jobs, and it's simultaneously trying to empower communities, right? So it's trying to do these two sort of things. One is sort of more traditional, creating jobs, getting employment, raising incomes. And then the other side is this sort of more 21st century thing of trying to empower communities and try to build inclusivity and to enhance accountability mechanisms and all these other governance type things, right? So the beauty of this study was it was trying to do an evaluation of a project that was simultaneously trying to do both of these things. And the big conclusion is, it finds no evidence for sustainable impacts of collective action, decision-making, or the involvement of marginalized groups, suggesting that the intervention did not durably reshape local institutions, but it did have these positive short-run effects on local public goods and economic outcomes. So take that at face value, as most sort of readers of this would, I think, published as it was in a super prestigious journal. That sort of the narrative of that, once that climbs up to the 13th floor of our esteemed room, of our organization, is that, oh, well, we've shown now, we have rigorous evidence that job creation programs work, but that CDD projects don't, right? That's what the net sort of takeaway is from these kinds of studies when they're done that kind of way. And I want to argue that the methodology behind all this is exactly more or less what it should have been, like in some sense, at least for a certain disciplinary space. This is what counts as a question, this is what counts as an answer. But I'm going to suggest in the complexity space that perhaps there are some unwarranted conclusions that might be taken if we just read these kind of results at face value. I want to try and just work you through that using some analytics and ways of getting you to a point where I hope you see that that's not such a crazy claim. So we always talk about things being complex as an adjective, and I just want to kind of make it into a noun in the sense of just put some structural characteristics around it, because most of what I find myself wrestling with in the world these days are deeply complex interventions. And together with my colleagues Lant Pritchard and Matt Andrews, we've been trying to formalize some of this kind of thinking into sort of, at least into some relatively easy to understand categories. And we sort of have these 4 different things that we think characterize a complex intervention. First of all, there's just lots of humans involved, lots of face-to-face interaction. And so the summary example there is the fact that for literally everybody in this room, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we hadn't gone through roughly 16,000 hours of face-to-face interaction from someone called teachers. Right? That's more or less how long it took from first grade through to your master's degree. I assume pretty much everyone in the room has one. That's how many hours it took to produce us. Every single one of us, 16,000 hours of people showing up for work every single day to teach us what we need to do so that we can have this conversation that we are now having. That's one characteristic. Lots of people have got to do lots of face-to-face interaction and negotiating. Second, there's lots of discretion involved in very complex interventions. It's hard to make big choices or little choices when the situations are inherently ambiguous. We formalize that in law, where judges or juries make discretionary calls on the basis of evidence, of course, but at the end of the day, it's a discretionary call. My mother and my sister, one of my sisters, are social workers. Their fun job is to, was, a little bit older, but they were, in their careers, was going around to families and having to make decisions about whether a family was sufficiently dysfunctional that it warranted them using the powers of the state granted to them to take children kicking and screaming away from their parents and make them wards of the state. Right? That's what it means to be a really tough social worker. That's complex work, right? Really, really gut-wrenching, emotionally traumatic work. Is there rigorous evidence on the basis of which that call gets made? There is evidence, there is experience, there is certainly some professional norms and procedures that one calls upon to do that. But at the end of the day, it's a judgment call, and maybe a different social worker would make a different kind of call, right? And I don't think it'll ever be a thing other than that. We wouldn't want it to be actually anything else. We don't want machines making those kinds of decisions. We want some evidentiary warehouse to be available to us, certainly. But at the end of the day, it's a discretionary call. And it's similar even with decisions to raise or lower interest rates. We have boards that convene a couple of times a year to decide whether an interest rate will move up by 1/4 of a point. Yes, there's a whole storehouse of data in which that decision gets made. But at the end of the day, it's still a discretionary call. Doctors, teachers, nurses, my wife is an EMT, so her job is to make enormously consequential discretionary calls at traffic accidents, right? So and of course, again, we want an evidence base to do that, but it's complex because, geez, you make the wrong decision, someone dies, right? And there's no other way of dealing with that problem because it is a complex problem. We need people to do that kind of work, and it's just really, really hard, but not in a rocket science brain surgery kind of way. It's hard because there are deep consequences with good people having to make those kinds of calls. Same as sports, same as we have referees, judges all the time making these professional calls, deep experience, deep evidence, but we've all been to football games where half the team is yelling and screaming at someone because they made, in our view, the wrong decision because they made a discretionary call. A third characteristic of complex interventions is that they impose obligations, right? In the health and education space, most people, most of the time, want those kinds of services, but certain people or certain companies really would probably rather not be regulated. They would probably rather not be taxed. Many of us would probably rather not be taxed in certain ways. They would rather not be inspected at ports when you show up to have them do things. They would rather not be caught by the police for doing even relatively minor kinds of things. So once you're imposing an imposition on people as opposed to giving them stuff they want, then you're in a complex space because people will find ways of trying to subvert the kind of actions that you are trying to put on top of them. And they'll buy you off, they will threaten you off, or they'll just ignore you, right? And that's complex work. We've got to figure out as an organization or as a society how to address those kinds of challenges. And the fourth characteristic is just there isn't a known solution that we can call upon to deal with this, right? How do we consolidate peace agreements after they've been made? You know? How do we empower minorities? Is there a top 10 list of things that we can guarantee we can ship around the world that will ensure that minority groups get a better stake in the way the decisions are made? We know some things, but they're just really different kinds of things than the way in which we know whether raising interest rates will lower inflation. Right? There's just the causal coupling associated with these kinds of activities is just much looser, inherently so, not because we're not smart enough, not because we haven't tried hard enough, not because there isn't adequate financing for research on this. It's just the nature of these particular problems that lead them to occupy that kind of space. And as I said at the beginning, development, because it's now stretched across these 17 wildly ambitious goals, some of the things we know how to do, and a whole bunch of the stuff we just don't, and we probably won't ever know how to do, at least ex ante. We may ex post figure out what it was that we did that made it possible to do this thing right, but going into many of the most wrenching situations, how do we build the rule of law in South Sudan right now? Right? Nobody knows how to do that. Maybe we have seasoned veterans who are brave enough to try and take on that kind of a task, but there isn't a toolkit that we can just give them and say, run off, go build the rule of law in South Sudan. Everything has to be figured out in situ. One of the current characteristics then of engaging with these kinds of interventions, if you're engaged in a task that looks like the ones I've just described, that has lots of people making lots of choices, imposing lots of obligations when they don't really know what they're doing, you're going to end up with impact trajectories that are just highly, highly variable. First of all, over time, and I'll have a bit more to say about that shortly, just that the nature of what you're doing is going to be likely to be highly non-linear and highly non-uniform, which makes it really, really hard to do an evaluation which is predetermined to be occurring within a particular time frame, usually at a political or administrative time frame. It's going to mean that your intervention is likely to be highly contingent, highly specific to the kind of context in which you've elicited, which might be great that you've done a rigorous evaluation so that yes, indeed, this particular strategy for getting more kids to learn more things in schools works fabulously in Cameroon. But whether, in fact, it works as well in rural Cameroon or whether it works as well in Chad or in Paraguay is a much more vexed question. And so yes, we can have a singularity with regards to a serious claim about the impact of what we're doing, but whether this can aggregate or more particularly be relevant for different kinds of groups in different kinds of places is much more likely to be contested. Scales of operation. There's been increasing literature, and I think really interesting literature, looking at the transitions that we go from and the logic that we follow when we're doing our standard work, from pilot to a big program, for example. Yeah? And I think one of the consequences of engaging in complex work is that logical transformation must be demonstrated rather than assumed. We've got a nice small literature now of interesting cases of things that worked fabulously as pilots that sort of bombed out when they went to scale. On the contrary, things that were kind of blah as pilots, but what do you know, once you made it a flagship national program, everybody super cared about it, it was too big to fail, and it did actually work in some empirical sense. So, as I like to say, X may get you Y, and 10X may get you 10Y, or may not get you 10Y, which is great math and often not really good social science. And I think for complex interventions, that is very much the case as well. And finally, that complex interventions are heavily dependent on the implementation capability or the implementing organization that does this particular work. Again, we've nice research evolving now, just looking exactly the same intervention introduced by an NGO, introduced by a government, introduced by a private sector organization, exactly the same canned technology, as it were, the technology itself verified by a nice body of scholarly research, but it turns out that you get really, really different impacts when you have this particular intervention. Contract teachers, for example, versus salaried teachers. Whether that then is a verifiable result depends, or expectation rather, will depend very heavily on whether or who actually is doing the intervention. This is the time sort of issue, and the standard way in which we taught this or we learn this, we have a baseline, we have some period of time elapses, we have a follow-up, we have a treatment or control group, we have some kind of counterfactual mechanism in place that enables us to net out the effect, and we then take away the baseline from the follow-up, and voila, there we have the net impact that we think has been achieved. But once you move out of this, the nonlinearity space, once you don't just go from here to there, then life becomes way more complicated with regards to the kinds of claims that you start to make. And I came to this just for the first time I saw this when I came to the bank and did my first impact evaluation seminar. I was sort of thinking, oh, this is what I need to be doing and worrying about. I think, well, geez, my PhD's in comparative historical sociology. We never got from here to there anywhere in anything I ever studied in a straight line. Most of the most wrenching things that humans have achieved with regards to ending slavery or promoting democracy or ending colonialism, geez, man, that just never took, that took decades, centuries. It had all sorts of different ways of getting there. And so you can get up, and if you can get from here to there in very different pathways, in fact an infinite number of pathways, then it can mean many different things for the kinds of interpretations that you make. For example, if we were to do the evaluation at time C in this particular intervention, we'd make identical claims about this thing worked. Yes, indeed it did. But if we did the evaluation at point A, right, unbeknownst to the kind of trajectory that we were on, we'd end up with 4 different conclusions as to whether this particular intervention had worked. Great, okay, not at all, actually made things worse. Those are the 4 conclusions that a rigorous evaluation at face value would lead you to interpret, ignorant of the kind of trajectory that you were on. And the same goes when you then promote that into the future, right? So when we're looking at most of the work that is done in the social development space here at the bank or in governance reforms, we're dealing with all these cases where we have numerous ongoing transactions, high amounts of discretion, pervasive principal agent challenges with what's decided in the center is maybe very different to what's going on out in rural areas. Often politically very contentious. People don't know, elites might not want to be challenged on how their money is being spent. They might not want to be accountable for the resources that are entrusted to them. And thus, I think a lot of the impact trajectories that were associated with this work need to be much more cognizant of the fact that they, by virtue of being complex, are on these very different kinds of journeys, and those journeys themselves depended on the structural characteristics of the intervention, the context in which they're working, and the capability of the organizational system imparted with actually doing this work. What are the consequences for evaluation? I think the first is that assessing the impact is hard. Anyone who does evaluation is fully aware of that. But it's deeply contingent and very time-bound. And I think that in standard ways of thinking about interventions are just really up against many limits once they start to wrestle with these very complex interventions. One of the big characteristics or assumptions that makes a standard evaluation possible, certainly a randomized control trial possible, is this thing called the unit homogeneity assumption, that everybody receives an identical form of the treatment. Well, there kind of almost is no counterfactual in a truly complex intervention because it's so customized, so individualized, and so discrete that it's really hard actually to net out all other things, some ceteris paribus kind of assumption about what else might have been going on in that particular situation. Generalizing is harder still, and that knowledge rarely aggregates, and that's a really tough one for us, right? As an organization, that there are just lots of necessary reinventings of the wheel that have to be involved. I've been involved recently in some public sector reform work, and by virtue of reading this stuff, was wanting to look back on previous generations that sort of did through this public sector reform work, and it's just either scary or weird to read the kinds of conclusions that were reached on these evaluations of public sector done 30 or 40 years ago, and what we reached about the importance of leadership, about the importance of political support over long periods of time, about getting good technical expertise. I'm going to wager in 30 or 40 years' time, when our grandchildren are doing these evaluations, that's the kind of conclusion they're going to reach as well. Because that's what it is. That's what the nature of this conclusion is. It doesn't mean you don't have to do the evaluation, because it's in the very eliciting of those issues each and every time that the conversations start to take place. Just a little party fact so that you can throw in if you remember nothing else from this presentation. The world record for the most number of co-authors on a published academic paper is, on this, as you see on there on the screen, 5,154. Right? That's just super cool. When they discovered the Higgs boson particle. Why can they do that? Because knowledge in that space super aggregates. We really do learn over time how to do things. Well, in the world of parenting, in the world of doing a lot of the work we do in governance, it doesn't aggregate. It's just super slow. And it's, again, not because of intelligence. It's not because we haven't tried hard enough. It's just because the nature of these problems, the essence of wrestling with a complex intervention is that you have to keep learning a lot of lessons the hard way. That's what governance is about too, why we don't have fantastic governments in even in rich countries. Well, sometimes they unravel, sometimes they go backwards, but not because we haven't learned the lessons, just because the lessons themselves have to be kept being learnt every single time. And I think those are some of the great things that we need to take from these things. My final slide. What do we do? Well, I think we need to get beyond rigorous methodology per se, as the final arbiter of impact. Right? As I think I heard Howard saying, methods are part of the claiming apparatus that you bring to bear when you're trying to make claims about any type of intervention, whether it's in the medical space or the hardcore scientific space. Yes, it's always good to have a weaker and stronger methodology than a weaker one, but the essence of doing good social science has always been to let problems drive solutions, to let the problem itself determine the kind of package of resourcing that you bring to bear in all of those, in those particular situations. And especially, I think, we need to condition so much of our interpreting on the time frames over which we would expect things to achieve and occur. Right? Most of the women in this room, I'm sure, are aware that the Mary Wollstonecraft wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1793. Here we are 225 years later. That still hasn't happened. Does that mean it's failed because we haven't achieved gender parity? Well, kind of, yeah. But maybe it just takes that long. Maybe it's just brutally difficult to do even something that we would all agree on, let alone something that's really hard, like ending the drug trade in Colombia or something like that. Right? These are just really wrenchingly complicated problems that just take long time frames. And any particular intervention that's engaging on these issues, I think, needs to take those particular points equally seriously. So to end where I started, sort of what do I think we should conclude from a study like the one that I just said, that I just read about? Well, I think that we need to be much more distinct, take much more attention of the distinctive analytical features of the kinds of interventions that are being talked about here. And relying on the rigorous method per se as the basis on which we say, yes, the job creation works and no, the community empowerment doesn't. That claim is only true if these are both following along identical in-track trajectories over time. But if job creation is going that way and empowering poor communities is inherently a flat line before maybe it suddenly changes, like a punctuated equilibrium. If you're in that kind of space, the ways in which that incentivizes so much of our work to be in the short-term space, to be in the work that achieves the initial impact, that gets it within the time frame that we want it to. Essence doubles down on producing lots of sunflowers and doesn't invest anything in building lots of oak trees. Oak trees just take 200 frickin' years to become the trees they are, and sunflowers take 6 weeks. And if I gave you a random bunch of seeds and assessed your efficacy as a farmer, and said, I'm going to come back in 6 weeks and see who's got the highest plant, and that's going to be the measure of your effectiveness, we'd think that was nuts if somebody got the sunflowers and someone else got the acorns, right? We wouldn't make a claim that they'd failed because their little plant was still stuck in the ground trying to figure out how to germinate, right? We don't have anything like that as the routine basis on which we think about the interventions we're engaged in development. I think if we're more professionalized in that space, we would have it, and thus the big task for AEG is to try and weld all of this work being done in the evidence space with a much richer theory of theory and a much richer set of methodologies that can incorporate all of the enormous heterogeneity that exists in the world and that we claim that we're in the business of addressing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm not going to attempt to summarize what has been said, but some interesting points were raised. Howard really made us aware of the importance of upping our game on the transparency of methods, increasing the reliability of our methodologies, having standards for methods to enhance the defensibility of the inference that we make, and also to actually show that the inference that was made can be thoroughly checked. And he offered us various ways of doing that. And Michael elucidated that independent of the method used, there are inherent dimensions of complexity which should make us pause, and which should make us think about being eclectic in the choice of methods, and being very rigorous in developing a solid understanding of what is going on the ground to develop inference. So these are some of the important points, but I'm sure there are many more. And it's now my pleasure to invite Alison Evans to the floor to lead us into a conversation with the two experts. Alison Evans is the Director General of Evaluation of the Independent Evaluation Group. She was formerly Chief Commissioner of the ICAI, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact in the UK, and she was also Director of the Overseas Development Institute. Thank you, Alison, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. I have a technological failure, so I shall swap mics with you. Great, thank you very much, and it's lovely to see all of you here. And thank you so much, Howard and Michael, for a very stimulating set of presentations. And if I thought I didn't have enough to keep me awake at night, I now have a whole heap of more things to keep me awake to think about. Let me just say a few things by introduction, and then I'm going to try and engage both of you in a bit of a conversation before we open up the floor to some questions and discussion. So, Howard, I took a number of things from your presentation, and first to say thank you very much for the very sort of direct feedback to IEG. We're certainly listening and taking on board many of your reflections, and we'll continue to do so, and look forward to the paper, by the way. But I suppose the big picture is, around this evidence revolution is that it's a revolution that never ends. We're constantly working at it, and it is constantly gathering pace. And to some extent, you're either on it or you're not, or you're either in it or you're not. And to use your analogy, we need to not be just thinking about riding the wave of it, but also how we're doing so. So I thought I took quite a lot of your presentation to focus very much not just on what we do, but how we do it, and making sure that we're being very explicit about both the evaluation questions that we're addressing, but crucially what the best fit methodologies are for addressing those particular questions. It's not good enough in any evaluation of enterprise just to go out on a fishing trip. We need to be very clear at what question are we really looking to address, and what methodologies best fit those questions. And I think your point about is it the fourth wave now we're in on sort of knowledge brokering, is I think what I really like about your formulation there is that this isn't a distraction to evidence building and evaluation. The knowledge brokering, the knowledge dissemination piece is actually fundamental to make evidence useful. And if we're not producing evidence to make it useful, then why are we doing it at all, essentially? And I see that as being a crucial challenge for evaluation writ large, but here within the World Bank Group too. If we in IEG are not using our evaluative evidence in a way that is most useful, or generating it is most useful for the organisation, then why are we doing it? So, Michael, you had some really good challenges too, and I suppose one of the things I kept thinking about is, if I could distill some of your messages there, it felt like, don't get hidebound or hung up on trying to find first best methodological solutions to what are essentially third best challenging contexts and issues and problems. The point is finding a methodological toolkit that's really suited and adaptable to these incredibly challenging problems, development problems and development contexts that we're all increasingly working in. I also heard, or perhaps I wanted to hear, that we need to increase the space for judgment. And I know that's a theme of a number of interesting works, not least by Dan Honig and others, about increasing the space for judgment and not losing sight of that in all the desire to be rigorous and to be data-driven. And I think I heard something which may also fit with Howard, that actually the evidence revolution also needs a monitoring revolution in a way. We need to find a way to get back into the monitoring space and use that to really help us both understand and also support change. I think something you've said in other contexts, Michael, the need to move from just looking at the effects of causes, but also thinking about the causes of effects, which I find very appealing. Okay, so to some questions. Can I start, Howard, with you first? You made some really interesting points about the need to invest in tools that allow us to systematize evidence, that allow us to build, to aggregate and build more systematic evidence narratives, if you like, about what works and what perhaps doesn't work. Michael, and actually before I say what I heard from Michael on that, we had a very interesting event recently where somebody who's very practiced in the art of impact evaluation said, you know, we've done a great job in impact evaluation in building lots of bricks, but we haven't yet really built many houses. i.e. we haven't really put them together in a way where we can see bigger patterns. And I thought that was a really nice way of thinking about it. And I think what you were saying, Howard, we've got to do more of that. We need more houses. But Michael, you also said, well, we don't really know what the shape of the house is, because actually it's all terribly complex, and our bricks, we could put them together in a million different ways. So to you, Howard, in a way, is there a difference in your positions on this one around aggregating knowledge and aggregating evidence? Is Michael saying something different to you?
Well, Michael didn't get to the bottom of his penultimate slide where systematic reviews are problematic and waste of time and everything, which was the thing I most contested in. I thought we were largely actually in agreement. I mean, people will see me in different guises, I think, when they hear me speak. Sometimes you'll hear me being very clear and positivist and just, this is very straightforward, just do it. And other times you'll hear me I'm being a bit more constructivist and a bit more like, well, it's a bit messy and fuzzy out there and it's not quite so straightforward. And I mean, I actually believe both those things. And so I have been strongly immersed in systematic review methodology for the last 5 years now, and it's been a real revelation. And one revelation, one I share today, is the sheer scale of errors and biases in traditional research, which are frankly appalling. And that when we do what we call critical appraisal research in reviews, we generally find most research is low to medium quality. We very, very rarely find studies of high quality. The term we normally use is confidence study findings, because there might be sources of bias in a study that no fault of the authors, they did the best they could, but something happened. We just need to work on homelessness in developed countries. There's enormous rates of attrition when you're doing studies of homelessness. And there's nothing, one study did its power calculation, showing 50% attrition, it got 80%. So, you know, it was underpowered, but really they did their best. So there are problems to be addressed in study quality. But what I've learned is that there are a lot of tools out there for actually determining study quality and saying what's a good study, what's a bad study. And at Campbell, we're expanding our scope, not just doing reviews of effectiveness, but doing reviews of prevalence, say, or reviews of qualitative literature around barriers and facilitators. And to say prevalence, it turns out there's enormous literature on how you measure prevalence and sort of issues you come into once you start to try and review literatures, different studies on prevalence, because they have different definitions of the condition being assessed, different reference populations or reference periods or whatever. And whenever you get down to the detail of a study, then you start to run into problems and choices and judgments. And this is the thing about minimizing sources of bias, and this is going to be one of the key things in the paper, which is there's just enormous amounts of judgment going on in the way IAG does its evaluations. And that means, in my view, no IAG evaluation will be replicable. And I think that's a problem. And I don't think you'll ever actually ensure that it's replicable, but I think you can make it more likely to be replicable. And a lot of that is around evidence standards and transparency. I haven't get to answer your question yet. So I do strongly believe that actually, given the vast growth of the rate of bricks, and there's something like 70 billion academic published papers now, and the grey literature is more than double that. So no one could possibly use all those bricks in any sensible way except by building houses. And so we need to be getting those houses built. And the problem in our areas where Campbell works is a shortage of houses, not the lack of bricks or the potential for building houses. So in the Cochrane Library, our counterpart half, they have over 8,000 reviews published on really very specific topics. They've had a lot of bricks for many years, and they've built over 8,000 houses. The Campbell Library have fewer than 200 reviews, and we cover everything but health, education, social welfare, crime and justice, international development, agriculture. It's all there. So we should be having thousands of reviews, and increasingly, the bricks are there. And I think there are some problems in the designs of these houses, but not so much that we can't build them.
Michael, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's working. Oh, thank you for giving voice to the things I didn't say that I wanted to. This whole role of navigation, to use Dan Hunning's wonderful term and book, and the role that choices play in a lot of what we do. But I think that's true of life in general, right? Do we have rigorous evidence that getting 150 people to take off time from doing their job to sit in a conference room, listening to people talk about evaluation, meets a cost-benefit threshold such that at the end of the day we all go home and we're rigorously able to say, yes, we've learned something that will improve what we do? We have meetings like this because people like us have meetings like this. This is what we do. This is what professionals do. And we don't depend on some rational, some deep sort of empirical calculation to say, well, should we hold the meeting or should we not? Right? We want to hold a meeting. What are we going to hold it on? Right? So I think a lot of the stuff in the most complex spaces around building the rule of law, about enhancing the role that minorities play in a contested democratic space, the role of improving the participation of minority groups, all that stuff is just stuff we care about. And so we do it because we care about it, and then we got to figure out on that basis then sort of what's going to work in this particular place. But gee, so many of the things that if we wait around for the gold standard piece of evidence, then we're not going to ever get it. We only get to the mountaintop by figuring out how to by being willing to do a lot of stuff that people think is crazy, by actually trying to climb the mountain in the first place. So I'm all for, in a long run sense, accumulating bodies of knowledge. And my sort of meta point was that there are certain types of problems which, in the knowledge aggregation space, where the systematic reviews are exactly what we should be doing. Right? My caution rather than my dismissal was saying, when you're in the complex space, if we had 20 versions of that study that I just put up on the slide there, and took that at face value, tossed it into a hopper and say, okay, what is the preponderance of the evidence suggest about these things? Yes, these job creation programs work. No, these community empowerment projects don't. I think, but everything that humans have really, really cared about trying to get greater justice and greater equality and greater freedom and all these things, they're all just long marches into obscurity where you risk your life in some cases to be able to try and bring about that change. And that's part of the development story too, not just sort of can we get the student-teacher ratio right so that we optimize learning in a classroom. There are people that worry about that, and they should worry about that. I just, for whatever reason, I'm cursed with wrestling with problems that are just really, really wrenchingly, vexingly hard. And that we should only move forth on these issues once we have a preponderance of evidence. That's just not how anything great ever happened in the world, as far as I can see. But the great stuff happens because someone's crazy enough to go west by sailing east, by being able to suggest that all humans are actually equal. I mean, that doesn't happen because people have the rigorous evidence and then they move. They do that as a matter of conviction. And once you're in that space, man, it's just it's a much more contested space, and that's okay. And we should be okay with development's put us in that space. You can't be in development without having to deal with a package that incorporates all of this kind of stuff. And you mentioned the effects of causes versus the causes of effects. I mean, it was John Stuart Mill thinking about that in the 19th century. That was his expression. Like, he was worried about that stuff in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, where all sorts of crazy stuff was going on, and said, if we just only do if we only worry about the effects of the causes, then we're missing half of what we really need to know, which is stuff happens. Why did that stuff happen? And that should be normal part of how we think and function in the evaluation space.
Do you want to come back on that, Howard?
Okay, so this is part of my Well, the two things I come back on. So just on back on the example you used. So there are 24 studies, not 20, that we reviewed in a review we presented in this room about a year and a half ago, and despite the enormous heterogeneity of the programs and the context, none of them whatsoever show any effect on the governance or social cohesion indicators. They do show positive effects on the other outcomes, so the outcome, the job creation, or particularly the creating small-scale social infrastructure. They're very good at that, but they're not good at, and we took, again, our report was also somewhere saying, oh, it shows CDD doesn't work, and that wasn't the point. It doesn't work on one thing, but it did work on another thing. So the question is your reflection on how much evidence do you need when there is heterogeneity, but you've got a clear message coming across despite all the heterogeneity. On the causal effect versus effects of causes, the causes of effects, they say, well, so public sector reform happened in this country, so and so, what role did the bank play in that process? Versus effects of causes, which the World Bank had a reform program, what's its effects? My view is very much when you are looking at causal type questions for that sort of issue, particularly using small and case study based approaches, you have to use a causal effects type approach. And so you have to say, okay, this is what happened, this is the overall social change or governmental change that took place, is what drove that, and then can we see any footprints of the bank in that? If you start from the other end, working from drawing your theory of change or long time from left to right, you will find those footprints even though they're not there. And so it's one of the potential sources of bias, is it going about it the wrong way. Depends on what the evaluation questions are. So when you're saying, okay, what does the bank do? Well, then you can use your effect-based approach, your cause-based approach. You start by building up the portfolio from what the bank did. If we want to answer what role did the bank have, you have to start with what happened, what made that happen, and then, well, any little role maybe for the bank there.
Michael, you emphasise the importance of theories of change in your presentation. And we do a lot in IG around theories of change. It's one of the sort of fundamental sort of centerpieces of the way we think through our evaluations. But there are a lot of challenges, and you've alluded to several in a way in your presentation. Ex ante specification versus ex post kind of determination of what the theory were, incomplete theories that are essentially light on the mechanisms that actually drive change. But also there are things that can fall outside of that theory of change on issues of scale and sustainability and distribution, which are actually quite hard to capture. How can we do this better? What are we, are there things that we're just fundamentally missing about this? And do you have experience that you could share with us on how we can do that better?
I think this issue of mechanisms is I think a potentially important common ground for people across the sciences and the social sciences. Everybody talks that way, more or less, and I think that when we use the words theory of change, mostly, at least historically, I think we just meant the standard log frame sort of way of moving from inputs to activities to outcomes to outputs to outcomes to impacts, and that's the theory. And as long as there's some sort of chronological and coherent way in which those sort of things line up, then that's the theory of change. Well, kind of, yeah. But in the complex space, by definition, there's a lot that is unknown, and the actual places, if it's very place specific or very context specific with regards to how exactly this provision of money to a local community is going to be allocated, that's going to be anthropological, not sort of engineering, with regards to what constitutes then the theory of change. But I think helping people to talk and think that way routinely with regards to why exactly is this particular activity going to lead to this particular kind of outcome, and over what period of time would it be reasonable to expect these outcomes to aggregate into a discernible impact. But I think part of what I heard or wanted to hear you saying was also that our theories of change sort of presume that we can actually fully articulate what's going on ex ante, and a lot of another characteristic of complex interventions is they just have lots of unintended consequences, for better or for worse. Things sometimes work despite the program, or things that we thought were going okay actually really won't. The other reason why we want to have more granular mechanisms is because because there's such heterogeneity in the outcome space, right? So on average, we might find no impact, for example. And my colleague and friend Biju Rao did a wonderful paper 2 years ago in World Development where he was trying to explain an apparent non-result. They RCT'd this thing out of the wazoo and found no impact. Very disappointing. But it turned out that was the average impact. There was this huge standard deviation. It was great for these guys. It was actually awful for those people, but the net effect was 0, right? But maybe there's depending on the shape and the nature of that variation, the fact that it did work really well for a non-trivial, kind of large number of people itself could be really important. We want to know that. Well, what are the mechanisms that drove this notionally similar technology to produce, in this particular context, a fabulous result? This one, kind of nothing. And this one actually made things worse. It was gasoline on a fire. So you were meshing with a very sensitive local political apparatus, suddenly whilst in demanding accountability, and the village elites decided to crush the revolution before it got out of control. A lot of the studies that have been done on women's empowerment show exactly that same kind of reaction. The first thing that happens is that men get all uppity and start to actually be more violent than they had been before. Is that success or is that failure, right? Is that just the price you pay for the J-curve turning around and getting better? The only way to make sense of that, it seems to me, is having a much more granular understanding of the conditions under which particular mechanisms aggregate, not so much into the building of a house, but at least into assembling a certain set of factors that coalesce into an outcome that looks positive over here, where a similar combination of factors produces nothing over here, or actually makes things worse over there. And that's why we need to have what you said in the first part, which I didn't get to, but and I think this does complement what Howard's saying, which is we need a monitoring revolution as much as an evaluation revolution. We need to be able to see monitoring not just as this tool of compliance built in to make sure people aren't doing what they're not supposed to do, but actually seeing in the M&E space, having an M revolution that helps us to really unpack and explore and take seriously these very heterogeneous ways in which the different bricks produce tents over here and skyscrapers over there, or bomb bunkers over there. I don't know, the analogy breaks apart, but sort of different things, similar-ish things can be, under different conditions, can produce these different outcomes. And that's what we've got to have a much better way of assessing empirically, talking about theoretically, and then communicating to our organization in a much better way.
Thanks. Howard, can I move you on to something you talked a little bit about towards the end of your presentation about the kind of latest technological developments around AI and machine learning and so on. You sort of indicated that we in IG need to be on that bus, and to some extent we already are. But there are certainly some people I've spoken to inside and outside this organisation who say actually a good percentage of what we do in IG could be taken over by intelligent machines. Do you agree?
Yeah.
No, because of the space that remains for judgment in all of this, and so for the time being, at least, those judgments are made by human beings based on factors that we don't anticipate, and this is precisely why, whilst a lot of a systematic review process can be automated, so actually screening, when you do a review, you look for the relevant articles, and normally find tens of thousands. You have to screen them manually and go, okay, that's relevant, that's not, and it's a very time-consuming process. And say agreement rates are 80 to 85% for good screeners and coders, experienced ones, and 50% or so for inexperienced ones, which is bad. Machines can get to 90%. So why not? And they do it much quicker. So why not get machine learning in on that? And you can. There are now the commercial applications you can use for doing reviews that do have machine learning built into them. Similarly, you can have computers read articles, and they can extract the data, the coefficients needed for the meta-analysis and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of things that IEG does around defining a universe for a portfolio review, and then identifying the relevant bank projects to go in that portfolio that could actually be done using these approaches, and the determining the data extraction and coding for the textual analysis could be done also by machines, and that will be done experimentally to start with, but it won't be that long before it can be done on a fairly routine basis. There are many areas now, sports reports, financial reports, whole news reports, which are done by artificial intelligence. When in my talk when I was here last time, I showed the Chinese news service, which is entirely done by AI, and the newsreader himself is a robot. Yes, so the whole thing is just doesn't have any people involved whatsoever, and the IEG reports are more complicated than you could see an ICI review always done this way because ICI reviews do pull a lot of information out of existing documents, and there are elements where I used to do them. You sit there cutting and pasting, and it's very damn boring. So there are aspects of it that can be done automated, but other bits where you want the judgment to come in. So you can focus the time where the judgment is needed. And it is a bit what Mike was saying. We don't know where that is. We don't know where the questions are going to come up when you do an ICI review. Whether you're going to actually just agree with the rate and have disconnect, you don't know. And you don't know what it might be. It could be anything. It could just be something about the objectives really didn't match the program whatsoever. That the ICR seemed to be written about a totally different program, as it did happen to me in one case, and or something much more sort of more detailed. Actually read it. I remember doing one on this water program in China, and I'd read something in The Economist on water in China. I knew this ICR review was a whitewash of something actually quite a serious problem that the project was probably contributing to rather than helping. And so there's knowledge and experience comes in that we can't anticipate. So I think the aspects of the job that can be automated, and I think I've thought of the obvious ones. I think there are other ones I haven't thought about. The people working inside the processes and more familiar with what you're doing, we're able to think of. But there remain areas where that won't be the case, and we're able to do better, higher value work, which will free up from doing the other stuff that other people, machines can do.
Sorry, I keep turning. Bear with me for one more question, which is in my dreams, if you were both my advisors and you could give me 2 top things that I should be doing over the next few years to really address the kind of challenges you presented here today, to really put IG fit for purpose for the next few decades, what would it be?
So for me, it's my main message of the investment in methods and being transparent about your methods, ex ante statement and testing of those methods as you go forward with the evaluation. And across the method space, and I already mentioned this and Mike picked up on it, so different evaluation questions require different methods. It's not just about the causal questions. And some of the methods are quite simple. In a portfolio analysis, a lot of it is simply descriptions of bivariate tabulations, but that's a method. And so you just be clear about what they will be. There are other more difficult areas, and this effects of course, most causal effects discussion touched on it, where I think there are serious biases in the way IEG approaches evaluations, and the methods work will pick up on that and lead to some serious discussions about what you're doing. And the second one, since you picked up on it, and I think it's quite important, is the saving the monitoring from results.
Well, since you asked. If I was your advisor, I'd be telling you I wouldn't tell you anything. I would encourage you to use your powers and the powers of IEG to protect the space for judgment, right? Because I think we live in a world where things like AI and machine learning, big data are coming along, and geez, they're sexy, geez, they're seductive, geez, we want them to be great, and the cool kids are doing it, we want to be part of it, and we're going to look like dinosaurs if we don't. So let's kind of just go in all in it. And I think there's enormous amounts to be gained by this. I think those tools and technologies are there, like any other tool and technology. We should use them according to their comparative advantage. But the essence of complex work is that the reason we still cite Plato and Aristotle when we're talking about political theories, because people have been wrestling with how to run a freaking government for 4,000 years and haven't figured it out yet, and we won't ever figure it out. Our great-grandchildren, we're still having conversations like this, and part of our work is, I think, as professionals, as the World Bank, we're a countervailing power as much as a convening power, and part of our countervailing role is to appreciate the importance of problems in the world that can and should be addressed through ever advancing technologies, but to protect the space for the really complicated stuff that just requires inherent good wagered judgments, well wagered judgments. And that's so much a part of what development itself is, under pressure, when development's under siege, when younger people in particular or new country managers, directors are trying to do things in really tough places, your defense is always going to be what other people have told you is the way that you should do things. And if we're going to protect the space for judgment, that means working in very particular ways in very particular places and supporting people who transparently, on with deference as needed to the evidence available, are able to try out something with a longer term horizon, conscious that in the short run their annual reviews are going to look really ordinary, that they won't have any spectacular successes to show even maybe at 3 or 4 or 5 years time, that maybe actually what they're trying to do is just inherently on a really long time frame. Those are my bureaucratic heroes. Those are the people that are saying, I'm in this for the long haul. And I happen to be reading Rachel Kleinfeld's book at the moment, A Savage Order, and it's just the people doing that kind of stuff. I was reading, I was coming in this morning and just thinking, how much of what all these people that did the most wrenchingly super tough stuff in ending drug trade in Colombia or ending the awful violence in Bihar and India, how much of what the people are actually doing there was sort of done because they consulted experts like us? Most of them just winged it. Most of them just trusted they've got a good team around them and did wrenchingly difficult stuff that certainly I can't even begin to imagine how difficult that would work. What it means to do deals with drug lords and bring them into your government, because that's the price it takes to be able to bring and consolidate a peace accord. Who's going to supply the evidence that that's actually the rigorous way to think about this problem? No one, right? And maybe the deep ethical issues for us as a bank, like even if we knew that was true, even if we had enough historical experience that you've got to do deals with the devil in order to be able to get a peace agreement to stick for a generation. Are we going to stand on the 13th floor of the bank and sort of say, yeah, we're going to do deals with the devil because that's what the evidence says? So be as accommodating and using and deploying of the latest technologies, because they're tools like any other tool. We should use them, but use our professional standing, our organizational stature, and our own convictions to be able to protect the space for people trying to do things that are just super necessary, but by virtue of being super complex, are just not going to fit into all the administrative categories that we throw at them.
Thanks. So in some ways, Howard, you're telling us, give people a reason to believe and trust in the evidence you're presenting. And Michael, to some extent, you're saying, and don't do that at the price of creating a risk-averse environment where people don't try and are willing to sort of learn as they go. So that's the tightrope that we're walking in a way. And I think, I don't disagree with that. I'm going to pass back to Jos right now.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating conversation. Before I open the floor to questions, I'm going to use my prerogative of having the microphone. Just make one substantive point. So we were just very briefly talking about the use of machine learning in evaluation. As with all methods, it's not a very productive discussion to be for it or against it. Machine learning has arrived in the realm of evaluative inquiry and should be there. And there's a reason, there's a role for it. And one interesting way of looking upon it is to classify different problems that we're looking at. So we have the information classification and extraction problem. We have the summarizing problem. We have the prediction problem. We have the valuing problem. So already we are using AI in the classification and extraction realm. We have been doing that, for example, in the private sector evaluation work, where after testing several algorithms, we are reaching 70-75% of accuracy, perhaps. Doing better as humans, actually, we also looked at that. But it's a long way still for us to move ahead to these more complicated analysis along this continuum. So we should be very cautious as well as regarding several biases. Anyway, I stop here. I open the floor to questions from the room. Please be very brief in your questions, and if you want to direct your question at somebody in particular, please say so. Thank you. I think the first one is Elliot in the middle. Yes. We'll take several questions.
I found myself invited to sign up to one or two approaches, both of which I have a degree of sympathy for. I was trying to build bridges, and I was also trying to preempt in some ways Alison's question, which is, and so what? What do you do with all of this? And I felt that the bridge was the material you didn't provide, with the two things that neither of you quite said, but could easily be implied out of what you said. In your case, Howard, you anticipated that the next wave is about knowledge brokerage, whereas I thought that there's a lot of scope for saying that the next wave is about knowledge translation. And I'm making a big distinction between the idea that we target knowledge at our audiences more precisely versus we translate that knowledge into local context so that local knowledge becomes locally usable and usable in those local contexts. And I also felt with you, Michael, that you gave us a wonderful set of characteristics, many of which you've been writing about for years and others have as well, around the importance of time and context and delivery agents, etc. You didn't quite talk about, and now we could potentially start mapping contexts in terms of some of these attributes to identify temporary areas of stability where one might make interim probabilistic statements about context, which would allow us to take small steps, especially if our model was iterative rather than quick smash and grab evaluations. And both of these approaches for me, both the knowledge translation and the local mapping, are partly about a multidisciplinarity. And I see a lot of things in evaluation moving from what I call disciplinary appropriation, like first generation behavioral economics was a classic case of behavioral disciplinary appropriation, towards a more genuine form of disciplinarity, which is potentially woven into both of what you said, but it's a question of taking the so what question a stage further.
Thank you. Thank you for a classic example of a succinct question.
Jos, we'll talk about that later.
Please.
Hello, I'm Jackie Coolidge, a retiree. I wanted, first of all, just to offer a little bit of prehistory from what Howard was offering. So at USAID, I can attest, they were using the log frame in the mid-'80s. And they would say that it was built on, the work of Rand back in the 60s and so on. So it went through, lots of iterations, and the pendulum swinging really between this, learning versus accountability and the tension between these two, which I think is going to be a chronic struggle. So in my case, going sort of back and forth between M&E and operations and back again, in the mid to late 2000s, early teens, mid-teens, the pendulum was swinging back towards accountability here in the World Bank. And it was worrisome because here from what had been more of a learning sort of approach, certainly in IEG, and didn't impinge much on projects and so on, but as the accountability pendulums, swung back with a vengeance, and you had essentially people wanting to glom onto any numbers they could get, which had been coming out of IEG and the learning mode of doing things and making use of data, and suddenly it becomes an accountability thing. And the resources that are being available, there's always a time frame. So, Michael, I really liked what you were saying. I'm just wondering, Allison, how you think, practically speaking, you can maintain, really protect that space from those who are saying resources are scarce, we can't wait around forever. If you're telling us that this might not pay off within a 5-year period, or maybe, 6 or 7 years, well, there's just no way we can, do anything with it. So I'd be interested to hear, practically speaking, how you think you can hold the line on that.
Let's take one more question. There was one in the middle. Yes, please. Yes, Jelko.
Željko Bogatić, IG. 2 questions. Data. I was surprised that I didn't hear much more about data in terms of what we as the IG can do going forward. In most of, as I'm sure you're aware, in most of the IG major evaluations, there's always at the end, something that we find problematic with the data, with the meaningful data, with the relevant data, with the timely data, high frequency that we need in order to evaluate. You know, in half of African countries, we have one household survey. In many, there is zero. And we are trying to evaluate, you know, poverty reduction interventions, so on and so forth. So to what extent do you think we as the IAG can make a contribution by actually pushing the institution to produce and maybe even input forward some mandates on some of these really important data that we've been kind of you know, trying to push, but you know, with much less satisfactory results. So that's the question number one. The question number two is your perspective on the importance of thematic or sectoral expertise in Evaluators toolkit. You know, does it, you know, should we all become just method specialists and blind to different thematics expertise? Or we actually do need some thematic expertise in order to evaluate those thematic interventions? Thank you.
Okay, let's give the floor back to the panel. Maybe we can start with Alison, the question on balance between learning and accountability.
Is it a chronic struggle? Absolutely, yes. Certainly my perception over the years is that it is, although I do think we're entering a phase where there's much more reconciliation at a whole number of levels about, you know, the fact that these are attributes and parts of the evaluation, parts of our evaluation mandate which we can reconcile more effectively. So happy to talk more about that at some point. But I think on the point you made specifically on time frame, in a way, about how do we keep our gaze to the long term while recognizing that we have a set of steps here in the short term where we need to give evidence of performance. I mean, I do think that is absolutely a sort of quintessential challenge. For me, part of it comes down to having very open discussions and being very open and transparent across the bank group with operations around expectations and around what is the destination and what is reasonable to expect in the kind of timeframes that we're subjecting this operation to evaluation or these operations to evaluation. Very often we're not that clear about those expectations of time frame and change, and nor are the theories of change which drive operations that clear, quite honestly, and that open about expectations of when results will actually transpire. In some ways, I think we need to be more humble, not less so, in how we go about both designing those theories of change and interrogating them through evaluation, and recognizing very much that things can change, and things change sometimes for all the best reasons, I mean, legitimately so, and on occasion perhaps not so, and then we need to call those out. So I think, you know, what I heard from Howard was raise your game, and absolutely we need to do that. For what I heard from Michael, in a way, was keep looking beyond the end of your nose, and I think absolutely we need to, my job in IG is to make sure that those two things are things we're doing simultaneously, so we are essentially walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Maybe, Michael, you can say something about Elliot's question on theories of the middle range.
Theories of the middle range, yeah. Oh, I think an extension of what I was saying to what you are going to be talking about next on spatial, geospatial mapping is that, as I said, the essence of complex interventions is you're going to get huge heterogeneity across time and across space. And if you've got a really good database that can provide the equivalent of a local weather map for why things over here are going great and why things over there aren't, when almost the same people are doing the implementing, then that's a really useful thing to have, and it's really useful operationally, because that's if you're managing a project, the decisions you make are on a day-to-day basis, where the die is cast when you're actually managing a project. So you've got to work at it to learn in real time by where, how, and why all of that stuff is occurring. So I think the geospatial stuff can map really nicely onto what I was saying about monitoring, and that can be really one of the crucial ways in which one monitors, is to be able to have a much more real-time sense, if that's to the extent that's possible, but by deferring or engaging with that kind of material. The big challenge, though, I think, in the variation on time sort of question, within bureaucratic and accountability spaces, is that it's very hard to distinguish between whether history is going to be kind to you and it'll actually take 25 years and you'll be deemed a hero, or your project will be deemed that, or actually this is really awful. It should be shut down right now. It's never going to become an oak tree. It's just going to be. You should be shut down and stopped right now. And I think that's it's an impossible. There must be some impossibility theorem somewhere around all of that. I don't know how you resolve that, because there's so much of what people have tried to do in these really wrenching and vexing things. It's always unclear, always in the fog, and it's only when the fog lifts that it becomes clear, sort of whether history is going to be kind to you or not. And so that sort of issue, I've been thinking about that a lot in the work that I'm currently involved in, where we see organizational capability as being something that is so central to making complex reforms or interventions of one kind or another work. And I think that then is where the questions around sectoral expertise and these questions around timeframes and the questions around monitoring all sort of come together. Because the sectoral expertise is about being able to manage and make good professional judgments in the face of uncertainty. That's why we hire managers, or we have them, why we don't defer to machines to make a lot of decisions, because there is so much, and there's so much discretionary space that we want to protect it, not just out of self-interest because we're all out of a job if machines can do development, but precisely because there's just so many wrenching trade-offs to be made all the time everywhere. And yes, on a good day, evidence can be part of that, but evidence itself needs to be collected and curated. We need to, Morton Jervin's work, a whole bunch of people have just been showing, geez, even the things that the world's been collecting for 30 or 40, 50 years, like the system of national accounts, all these things that have a whole professional apparatus built around them, even there's just huge problems with data. So we can't get away, it seems to me, from this implementation question. And data we have to implement data. We have to implement the mechanisms by which it's collected and curated such that it can do the subsequent work we want it to do by informing whether what we're doing is noble and effective, or whether it's foolhardy and misguided. And so the evidence question and the data question all ultimately, to me, becomes sort of an organizational capability question. And there, I think the metric that we need to be focused much more on is the problems that we solve in real time. And the essence of doing complex work is just routinizing the problem-solving mechanisms. And work I've just finished on in Nigeria on a big health intervention, that was sort of one of the big recommendations we came with. Not does this work thumbs up or down, it's sort of what mechanisms were put in motion that helped people to be able to solve problems that before they didn't even have a language for talking about, let alone some tools or techniques for dealing with. And once you see problem solving as being a central task of what it takes to engage in complex interventions, then that's a very different kind of metric almost for thinking about what counts then as success in a particular intervention. But anyway, that's where my head's at right now.
Thank you. Howard, maybe you could speak to Elliot's first question and also Jelko's question on data and expertise.
I'll just briefly on Elliot's first point. I tend to conflate knowledge translation and brokering, and I take your point entirely, but actually they are separate, and knowledge translation is an important role, and I do entirely agree that knowledge needs to be, evidence needs to be curated for the specific context in which it's going to be used, because of the role of values, beneficiary preferences and so on, which are part of the decision-making environment. And so it's not only about the evidence, and so all of that comes into play. On to data. So I believe the MDBs as a whole, not just the bank, have so far been pretty much a major failure in investing in the evidence architecture. Back to my pyramid of what we need to basically get evidence out there and being used, the evidence that's available. And I think there are obvious platforms for this in the global partnerships in many areas, like GPE, for example, that should be doing much more to invest in the global architecture, evidence architecture. And the base of that evidence architecture, is on my diagram, is data. And so ensuring you have good quality, consistently measured data. And so what we see in health is that WHO has a classification of interventions, so people speak a common language about knowing what they're talking about when they talk about health interventions. So they have a basis of writing guidelines about interventions, they know what interventions are. But there's also the COMET initiative in health, by which you have core outcomes, 200 odd of them, across health that are commonly used in health studies. And so in many fields, there's been, every researcher who does a study makes up their own outcome measures. The whole movement the whole movement for data quality, so in psychometry, where actually to create measures, say a measure of depression, it's a career. People just develop tools, identify tools, develop tools that get validated in different contexts, and they get widely accepted. In any articles say, I'm using this and this tool that's been validated for this context by so-and-so. You don't see that in most development evaluations. So we're very ignorant, actually, in our profession about how things should be measured. Despite all the investment in SMS, DHS and so on, there's still people going around reinventing square wheels by making up their own measures for things which they're perfectly good measures. And that shouldn't be happening. And it's because of the failure of the MDBs to take data seriously. So I entirely agree that data will continue to be a problem until there is some wholesale effort. It's recognised any strategy should say, well, what are the data in our sector? And what are we doing about the data in our sector? And it may be individual bank projects, but it might be the global partnerships, the right channel for doing that. I think generally they are where they exist, but something, something's got to happen around that. And so it's a major, major issue because everything else rests on the data. On expertise, I'm a little bit ambivalent, but not that much. So systematic reviews, when you register a review at Campbell, when you first register the title, say you're planning to even start a design review, you're asked, well, who's in the team, what expertise do they have? And shows you've got content expertise. Now, my ambivalence just comes because I've been an evaluator all my life and I've evaluated lots of different types of things, but I think in our team I always insist we acquire expertise, we learn a lot about the sector. By bringing people, or just you learn about the sector, and you don't go in and think, I'm an economist, just trust me, I'm an economist. You actually talk to people, experts from the sector, and listen to what they know about the sector and what they think the issues are, and learn their language, just learn what their measures are and how they talk and how they design their programs and what their program is meant to achieve. So having expertise, which may not be the same as experts, involved in the evaluation is extremely important. And we all know, I mean, when I ran through IE, we funded studies which didn't have the requisite expertise in the team, and they suffered as a result, and they just produced nonsense. I mean, the theories of change were quacky, yes, of existence, and the results were just nonsensical because the interventions made no sense. And yeah, it's just people just doing things they seemed like a good idea, but they just didn't have the expertise in the sector to know what I mean, even basically not knowing what had been done before and what was known. This is one of my, I'll get me started now. One of my things about just failure to know what's well known for 20, 30 years. Some of the things you're talking about have been known. We do know them. We shouldn't keep rediscovering them because we do know them, and we should take them as being known. And there might be trouble in having them acted upon. There's different things. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to draw things to a close now. To thank very much, huge thanks to Howard, Michael, yours also, Sophie, for opening. Thank you all very much as well for participating in that. I think we've got lots to think about. In some ways, some easy answers maybe, and lots of also thorny problems to keep worrying away at. In the end, though, I think we're all agreed that the problem needs to define the method and not the other way around. And unless we're really good at focusing in on what the central, be it an evaluation problem or an evidence problem or an operational problem, we're not really going to be able to ever really start to solve it, or to use increasingly diverse methods to try and understand it. So I'll let it all come to a close there. We're going into another session that starts at
20 minutes.
20 minutes. So for those who are really, please, I think there's still some more refreshments outside. Please help yourselves. And the next session is going to be focusing more on the uses and futures linked to geospatial data in particular, and how they get applied in evaluation. Thank you, everybody.